In this lecture, we're going to be exploring our next area of socio-emotional development when we start to dissect this broad, kind of unusual idea of something called the self. Then we're going to break down the self into numerous components when we start talking about identity and personality in the next lecture. But before we get to a lot of the stuff that research is focused on with respect to personality and a little bit with identity, we're going to start by just giving us an overview of what this thing called the self is all about and how it relates to lifespan development. To better understand what the self is, I always encourage students to try out a little activity that I came up with a number of years ago. In this activity, I ask you to pretend that you are about to meet somebody new for the very first time. In the past, I've said, let's pretend you're going to go out on a blind date, but let's just say, for the sake of continuity and to make people not feel uncomfortable, that you're just going to meet somebody, period. Date or just somebody you're going to meet to potentially hang out. But for most of us, meeting somebody might be a little bit nerve-wracking, and you might not necessarily be comfortable just hanging out with somebody you've never talked to before. So let's say in this situation where you're about to meet somebody, you and this person agree to share a little bit about yourselves. In particular, you share a very accurate, up-to-date picture of yourself, much like the wonderful one you see pictured here of obviously a celebrity's head tattooed onto a weightlifter's body. So you essentially come up with a picture like that, like many of us do with some of our accounts. And you also give that person an overview of you while they're looking at your picture. What would you say? How would you describe yourselves to this individual? Once you're done thinking about how you would do this, or actually if you want to enjoy it, because we will do this later, write it down. Feel free to go to the next slide and we'll try to break down exactly what's probably included in that list of things that you use to describe yourself. As we mentioned, what you're doing when you're writing down all the information about yourself is talking about this thing, this conceptual idea called the self. My guess is that a number of you probably wrote some comparative physical features. You talked about if you were tall or short. You maybe talked about your size or your dimensions or hair color or eye color or something along that line. But in addition to that, you probably focused on some other things that we're going to be looking at in the next lecture. In particular, you probably talked a lot about your identity. That's essentially your roles and things you do in the social world. And you also talked about this thing called your personality, a collection of enduring characteristics that you kind of use with you across a multitude of different social situations. We're going to define personality a little bit better as we progress, but understand that if you said you were nice or you were creative or something like that, that's you getting at your personality. If we broke down pretty much everything you wrote, my guess is that we could categorize each and every item into one of these three groupings. And together, they comprise what we call the self. And this might lead you to say, well, how did I come up with these answers then? How did I describe myself in the way that I did? Well, the first thing you need to develop in order to be able to do this is something called self-recognition. The ability to understand that you are a unique person and that you possess things that other people do and don't possess. You can essentially look at yourself and say, well, I have these characteristics attributed to me, be it personality, identity, or physical characteristics. And for you to be able to not only recognize that you are a person and that people can see you and quantify or kind of compare you, but also that you do have these quantifiable, comparable categories, you have to develop another thing called self-understanding. I know it might seem like these things overlap a lot. They sort of do, but they are distinct. Self-recognition is just realizing that you are kind of a person, and self-understanding is recognizing what that person is actually like. Once you have those things, you're capable of doing that activity, albeit it might be inaccurate or accurate in a variety of different ways, and it probably morphs in a variety of different ways based on your age and based on a number of other components. We're going to talk in this class a lot more about how age and other things relate to some of the things we might write in an activity like that at different points in our life. When we start with the development of the self, it's probably important to first allude to something that we talked about earlier. In fact, we have to go all the way back to the Piaget ideas to get our first glimpse at this idea of something that we call the self. If you remember back to the idea of Piaget's, he suggested that at about a year of age, we start to develop this idea of something called a sense of self, where we can recognize ourselves in a mirror. And what that indicated to Piaget and many other cognitive psychologists is we were getting our first inklings of us being a person in the world and us being somebody that people could perceive. Now, what other researchers have argued is that even once we recognize ourselves in a mirror, this doesn't mean that we have a perfect concept of the self. In fact, others have argued that it's not until about a year and a half or so when we start to recognize this idea of possessions, mine, not mine, or brothers or sisters, not mine. This is when we start to really develop a clear understanding of the self and the fact that we are kind of a player in the world around us. The most research has suggested that it's not always at about a year that everybody starts to really have a strong sense of self, especially when we kind of just base it off of the mirror task. But it does seem to be very clear that as we're exiting infancy, we all have at least a kind of intuitive sense of us being a part of the world and us trying to kind of carve out a niche as to what makes us who we are. And this is really the precursor to some of the early development in the next stage, that's childhood. What we see oftentimes is kids finally, at about 2 years of age, once they're reaching early childhood, start to be able to describe certain things about themselves. Now, usually when children are doing this, they focus on physical skills or physical abilities. I can run, I can jump, I can do these kind of basic things. And as kids start to progress and start to learn quantities at around 2.5, 3, they tend to like to over exaggerate some of the things that they can do. I'm the best video game player ever, or I am stronger than 100 people. Things that obviously don't make much sense, and it might be because they don't necessarily recognize their limitations or what makes them unique. It could also be that they're not really good with numbers when they're 2.5, 3 years of age. But if your child is at a point where they start to really inflate things and compare themselves to others on physical abilities, don't sweat it at that point, because this is very, very common in early childhood. Now, when we get into middle childhood, 5, 6, 7 years of age, what we tend to see at around, actually more like 5 or 6, is kids starting to really compare themselves to others on various personality or kind of cognitive ability dimensions. I am a lot funnier than my friends, or I'm much better at reading or math or art. Those types of comparative things, and kind of focusing on skills that are more internalized, not necessarily externalized, like physical abilities, starts to become something that kids can be cognizant of at around, like I said, 5, 6 years of age. Probably also because as we're developing into this phase, we're just getting the early inklings of that thing we talked about in the Piaget section called a theory of mind, where we can start thinking about our own thoughts and having that internal dialogue. The belief is, at this point, we can start to really reflect on who we are, what we're like, and in doing that, we start to develop, even if again it's extremely inaccurate, that sense of self that starts to encapsulate cognitive and personality skills that really do differentiate us even more from into in the late childhood years is kind of a hyper vigilance We're focusing on comparative skills. What am I like in comparison to so and so in my class? What am I like in comparison to my siblings? And this is where we start to first see the inklings of this idea of something called identity, where we start to kind of look at our social niche in the world, which groups we're a part of, or what roles we play. We're going to focus a lot more on identity in the next class, but I feel it's important at this point to just kind of give everybody a heads up that, it's not until around 7, 8 years of age that we really start to see kids truly forming what would be considered an identity. And there's some other theories and ideas that are going to suggest there's other identity related things we're developing before that point. But again, 7, 8, 9, this is when we really start to compare ourselves a lot to others, and we start to really try to figure out what makes us who we are and how people perceive us in the social world. Another thing that might help boost this idea of an identity is the fact that we start to break up this idea of self into different categories. By the time we're about 4 or 5, we just come to the conclusion that we are who we are. But around 7, 8, 9, we can start to talk about who we'd like to be. Maybe we'd like to be a great pilot, or the strongest person in the world, or this math wizard, or whatever the heck we want to be. And that person we're striving for, we start to recognize isn't necessarily where we're at now, but if we could ideally get there, that's what we'd love to be. And this ability to kind of play with potential selves and what we would hope to become someday does seem to ground us a little bit more. And then we get to the point where we do away with a lot of those kind of weird numbers and inaccurate perceptions of the self and start to have kind of a more grounded sense of what makes us who we are, both in terms of where we belong and what makes us unique. It's not perfect. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit later about how we're never really great at having an accurate perception of ourselves. But at least we're significantly better at this point than we were when we were in our early and middle childhood ages. And this sets us up for quite the roller coaster when we transition from late childhood into early adolescence. There becomes almost a hyper-vigilance on trying to really define who we are. Now, if we're talking about the main focus of the self at this point, this actually links up to what we'll be talking about in the next video in terms of the concept of identity. Finding the niches that we fit into, finding the cliques that we can become a part of, finding those things that we can use to really show that we're this shining beacon of a person is something a lot of us focus on when we get into adolescence. And it does lead to some interesting times for lots of kids where they kind of tinker with trying out different things and joining different groups and trying to be seen in different ways amongst different people. It's potentially just because we're more cognitively flexible that we can do these types of things for the very first time. But some researchers have argued that for many of us, this is an exploratory era where we're really trying to solidify this sense of self that's going to pretty much stay with us for the rest of our lives. So to settle, we tend to really think about lots of different options that we have. We're in fact in the next lecture talk about a theorist named James Marsha who talked about how when we're trying to form an identity, we go through all these different stages and where we're at determines how comfortable we are with the identity that we've chosen. But for this class, just understand that we've integrated numerous selves together at this point, and we're much more flexible in the definition of the self because we really are at this point trying to sum up what makes us who we are across all those different facets that we talked about earlier. Physical things, identity, and personality. And it causes quite the amount of turbulence at this point. Past adolescence, things do start to settle. What we tend to see in many longitudinal studies is that as we get past little middle adolescence to late adolescence and start creeping into early adulthood, usually by the end of the teenage years, very few of us change. There are potentials for it, right? If certain extreme events happen in our lives, or we've put ourselves in dramatically different environments, we can see shifts in who we are. But for the most part, our self is pretty darn set by the time we get into adulthood. And at this point, what we really start to do is start to kind of contextualize the multitude of different selves that we might have formed in our head. Essentially, we can say, when I'm with my friends, this is the type of person I am. When I'm at work, this is the type of person I am. When I'm with family, these are things that make me who we are. And essentially, we're starting to mix together both the social worlds and our senses of who we are in those social worlds to have a more holistic view of ourselves. And what starts to happen at this point is we do start to become more accepting of contradictions between our behaviors and the person we define ourselves as. Now, this kind of ability to become more what we call flexible in our thinking, recognize that contradictions can pop up if there's conflicting forces, causes a really interesting side effect. Essentially, it allows us to be less stressed out about inconsistencies than we were, say, in childhood or especially adolescence. But that lack of stress doesn't come at no cost. Essentially, what we tend to see is once we are more comfortable with those inconsistencies, we don't get so worked up and think about the potential for needing to change our definition of the self when we are, for a continual amount of time, contradicting the person we describe ourselves as to others. One of my favorite phrases I ever heard from somebody who was talking about our kind of newfound ability to accept those contradictions is one where somebody told me the game we talk often differs from the game we walk. Essentially, it's saying who you say you are isn't always who you are when you get into adulthood. It's just we're so flexible with it, and our sense of self is so rigid by this point that we don't feel a need to contradict those situations where we're not acting in accordance with our definitions of the self. Now, this kind of consistency in our perception of the self lasts pretty much throughout our entire lifespan. The only thing that starts to pick up a little bit more as we progress into different eras of our life is our recognition of the past selves that existed. We can essentially, when we're in our 70s or 80s, or even 40s or 50s, honestly, talk about, say, our kid self, or our high school self, or our college days self, or our had no idea what I wanted to do with my life when I was in my 30s self. Whatever you kind of broke your life up into in terms of different categories, you usually are more comfortable talking about those selves. And it does sometimes give us the power to shift our definitions and become a little bit more accurate. But if we're looking at it from a developmental perspective, just understand that past selves start to be something that we see more commonly when we get into late adulthood. It seems to help us kind of have a better grounding of what we were like at different times and not see ourselves as this constantly linear person that we usually saw ourselves in at younger ages. We're looking at other things that we can relate the self to outside of lifespan development. It's really more subcategories of topics linked to the self that we see changing with age. One area that's been looked at a lot is how much we like or dislike the person that we eventually see ourselves as. And this relates to something we call self-esteem, our overall kind of judgment of how good we are as a person. What we see in lots of research is that our self-esteem does ebb and flow with age, like many of you probably have identified in your own lives. We tend to be at an all-time low in self-esteem in our late childhood, early adolescence years. I know some of you might have had a great time during those years, but if we're looking at the vast majority of the population, most of us were pretty miserable in those junior high and high school years. It's potentially because of emotions and how things pop up, but also for some inexplicable reason, most of us, in terms of judging who we are as a person, judge ourselves much more harshly at about this time. And in fact, lots of cases of depression and happiness issues and anxiety issues tend to be linked to low self-esteem at about this point in life. Now, there's also lots of mental health things that can flow things in different directions depending upon the person, but for most of us, when we get into early adulthood, we start to see a slight uptick in our self-esteem. And what's really interesting is that as we get older and older, at least in our culture, what we see is that esteem levels tend to continue to be boosted all the way until usually around the early 70s. And then we see a pretty precipitous drop as a lot of physical abilities and mental abilities start to decline. What's also really important to note here, if we're looking at charts like the one that you see behind these text files, or I guess that's just the writing, is that overall our self-esteem in the United States is overly high. Even when we're at our lowest, we usually still rate ourselves somewhere around a 3 out of 5 in terms of how much we like ourselves. We do see differences in other cultures, sometimes when modesty starts to play out, but whatever we see in terms of how people rate themselves in the United States, we always have to kind of hedge with our talk about people feeling worse about themselves because we do tend to rate ourselves fairly high, even if it's more just of an ego protective thing that some people argue it is. Topic that's often tied to just change and development is this idea of something called self-regulation. How able we are to match our definitions of who we are with our actual behaviors and skills that we like to talk about. And this idea of self-regulation actually has two different categories within it. One type of self-regulation is what we call primary control, where we're able to actually control selecting the environment that we use to define ourselves. If you describe yourself as very athletic, are you going to the gym a lot? Are you doing things that really bring out that athleticism? Describe yourself as a very thoughtful person. How often are you hitting up the library or going to debates or doing things that really challenge the mind? That's what primary control is all about. The other type of control that we look for in self-regulation is what we call secondary control, where we're looking at whether or not we can actually control our thoughts and our minds and personality-related behaviors, not necessarily the environment, but just how we're seen outwardly by others. And what we see when we look at these two is that they tend to align very well all the way into our 60s and 70s. But once we get about there, what we tend to see is that as people lose their physical and mental capacities, that there's a big dip in the primary control that we have. And we think that this big dip in primary control, or self-regulation related to primary control, is maybe where we see the dip that we talked about earlier in self-esteem. It might just be random correlations tied to other stuff, but when those two things are so intertwined, it gives us a big tell that even if we can control how we're behaving in different situations, losing the ability to pursue the things that we use to define ourselves does have an impact on us, not only in just our ability to regulate what we're doing, but maybe how we feel about what we're like. It's also important to note that this maybe also explains the low self-esteem that we talked about earlier when it comes to childhood and maybe even early adolescence. I know we got through this very quickly, but what we're really doing here in this lecture is just kind of setting the stage for more of the specifics that we're going to be talking about in the next class. The next lecture will definitely be a little bit longer, extremely long. I'll try to go through it at about the same pace, but just be ready because we're going to have a lot of stuff we're going to get into when we talk about identity and personality, both with respect to the theories behind them, how they're defined, and then how those things relate to age. And for now, make sure you study up on this, have a clear understanding of what makes all of these different elements unique, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.